Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Joe Woolgar and I'm from KinKera community. And I want to start by thanking you all for joining us today. I can appreciate that you're all very busy in your respective day-to-day lives. So I appreciate you taking the time to be here. For those of you that don't know us, we are KinKera community, an award-winning specialist disability accommodation provider. Our focus is on high quality, well-designed homes that actually work for people who live in them, while still meeting the complexity of the NDIS requirements. And a big part of what we do is help participants and families and providers actually navigate the system in a way that leads to better outcomes, not just more paperwork. And today's webinar is part of our ongoing education series. Earlier this year, we hosted a strategic guide to SDA applications with Greg Barry, and we're really pleased to be continuing that conversation with today's session. And today's session is called The 8 Big Shifts You Cannot Afford to Miss. And we are going to look at some of the most important changes happening across the NDIS right now and what they mean in practice, and where funding can quietly slip through the cracks if we're not paying attention. It's great to see that we have a real mix of people joining us in the webinar today, including support coordinators, SIL providers, allied health professionals, and parents and guardians of people in the scheme. This webinar has been put together with all of you in mind, with a strong focus on clear and practical takeaways. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Brent Woolgar. Brent is widely regarded as an industry expert in the NDIS housing and SDA space, not exclusively, but the sector as a whole. He brings together an engineering mindset, more than 2 decades of consulting in accessible design, and a deep hands-on experience across a wide range of NDIS projects. He has worked with parent groups, small and large providers, the government, community housing providers, investors, developers, as well as financial institutions that sit behind many of these projects. On top of his professional background, Brent also brings a lived experience as a parent. He is the father of teenage identical twins, one of whom lives with cerebral palsy, which adds a very grounded, real-world perspective to the way that he approaches this work, and we are very fortunate to have him leading today's session. Before I hand over to Brent, a few quick housekeeping points. First and foremost, this session is being recorded. After the webinar, we will send all registered attendees a copy of the slide deck, and the recording will be available on our YouTube page, KinKera Community, for free viewing. Please keep your microphone on mute during the presentation to minimize any background noise. You are welcome to have your camera on or off, whatever you prefer. And please use the Q&A chat box to type your questions as we go. I will be vetting the questions in the background, and I will weave a few of those really relevant questions into the session while Brent is on that particular topic. But we will keep the majority for a more structured Q&A session at the end. And we're aiming for around 60 minutes today in total, including time for questions. If you have any technical issues, try leaving and then rejoining the meeting first. If those problems do continue, please pop a note in the chat and our technician Wes will do his best to help. So the purpose of today is simple. There are significant shifts happening across the NDIS. If we do not understand them, funding and opportunities can definitely be missed. And our goal is to give you clear information, practical examples, and some concrete steps to take away. And on that note, I will hand over to Brent to get us started. Brent, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction, Joe. Just for everyone joining us as well, as Joe mentioned, I've been working in the NDIS space since its very beginning. And I also do have a son who's an NDIS participant on a home and living journey as we speak. So I'm not sure if it's a good or a bad thing, but I sort of live, eat and breathe the NDIS 24/7 from all various perspectives. I've also had the pleasure of working with KinKera pretty much since its inception. And I do have experience with a vast number of STA providers, and I'm really proud of my association with KinKera because they're one of the leaders in terms of actually doing things right. And I say that from a participant perspective: good quality housing, good locations, and the right focus on making sure that people get the best outcomes. So it's a pleasure being here today. So as Joe mentioned, we're going to talk about 8 big shifts in the NDIS. Now, I wish it was only 8, but we're going to focus on the main things that are happening. And this is going to be very much relevant whether you are a participant yourself, a representative, a parent, a guardian, etc., a provider, a support coordinator, allied health, anything to do, any touch points with the NDIS. There are things happening that you really should be aware of because they have potentially quite far-reaching implications. So what are they? So we've obviously got mandatory registration happening. Now, we're not going to talk much about that because that is pretty much on our doorstep as we speak. Eligibility reassessments, impairment notices, NDIS support lists, needs assessments, new framework plans, separation of home and living supports, and coupled with all that happening in parallel, the transition from PROTA to PACE. So there is a ton of stuff happening at the moment, and there's potential risk at pretty much every single thing that's happening, regardless of your perspective. I really like this slide because it does sort of summarize how everything fits together. So you can link all this back to the legislation changes in October 24. It imagined a new process for the NDIS. And so we've made this relatively easy to understand what that process is. So eligibility assessments for people joining the scheme for the first time, or eligibility reassessments of existing NDIS participants. So again, we've been told in the next 5 years, every single NDIS participant will go through that reassessment process at some point. So that process, that eligibility assessment, reassessment process, is to establish your ability to meet the requirements or disability requirements to meet access to the scheme. That's all very clearly spelt out in various documentation. We won't be going into that in detail today. One of the new processes that takes place once that disability-related access has been established is to translate or transcribe those disability access conditions, for want of a better expression, into an impairment notice. So we're mapping all the different disabilities that can gain access to the NDIS and grouping them in 6 impairment categories. I'm going to have a closer look at what they are shortly. The impairment notice is incredibly important because it's only the areas where you have an impairment notice where you will be eligible to go to the next step, which is a needs assessment. And I'll give you a practical example of how all that fits together as well. The needs assessment is then the process where they look at the individual with that impairment, with that disability, and what needs does that person have? And obviously that translates into an NDIS funded plan. That plan is then built in what is called the new framework. It's built in PACE, which is the new portal. And I assume we've got people that are kind of in that process of transferring between PROTA and PACE at the moment. We're going to touch on PACE towards the end of the presentation as well, because there's some really key things to understand about that transition as well. If when you get a copy of the slides, I think you'll find, and you'll probably revisit that particular slide just to get an understanding of that process that people are going to be channeled through. So reassessment. So I'm not looking at assessment for people joining the first time. I'm looking at the cohort of people that we're probably all associated with, the current NDIS participants. Where the risks lie in that reassessment process is that if the NDIS does not have information about every disability or every impairment category. Now, as I mentioned, I was going to give you a practical example of that. So my son, and I do have my son's permission to talk in broad terms about his disability. He recently didn't have a reassessment. He just had a plan review and a plan transition from PROTA to PACE. Through that process, I asked the planner, are we going to get an impairment notice? The answer was no, because it wasn't an eligibility reassessment. But I pushed a little bit harder and I said, just out of curiosity, what do you have on your system there in terms of what impairment categories he may be eligible for when he comes up for reassessment? And to my horror, there was actually one whole category missing. So it just showed to me, I live, eat and breathe this stuff. And if I hadn't asked that question, there is potential for one whole impairment category to not be considered when it's actually structuring his plan. And that actual category was the predominant category that drove his support needs. So I reflect that to anyone that I speak to, that you can't assume that the NDIS know everything that they need to know in terms of this new process. There is a process that a participant representative nominee can reach out to the NDIS and ask for information relating to what does the NDIS have on their files in terms of what disability met access, what secondary disabilities may be in play, etc. And I would really recommend everyone to do that at the appropriate point in time to just understand what the NDIS already know and what gaps you might need to fill. So the other risks that can occur in this reassessment process, it's timing. So the NDIS are telling us that you'll get tapped on the shoulder and given 90 days to prepare for the reassessment. Now, depending on where you're located, if you live in a capital city, 90 days, okay, that might be tight, but probably doable to get the relevant information. It might be OT reports, psychology reports, whatever the case might be. If you live in Cairns, yeah, okay, 90 days might be starting to get a little bit tight. If you live outside of a major population centre, 90 days is too short. So again, it's knowing that you've got the clock is ticking as soon as you get notified that a reassessment is taking place. Contact the NDIS, find out what information they have, find out potentially what information, what holes you need to fill, and do it immediately. So the eligibility reassessment process, so they may ask for additional information, they may not. Regardless, I would certainly reach out and check. There's a lot of reassessments taking place at this point in time. You've no doubt heard about Thriving Kids, and very much a focus at that early entry point of the NDIS to potentially divert certain cohorts of people away from the NDIS into other programs. We've actually also heard recently a lot of providers that are providing support across the NDIS and potentially aged care as well are seeing an unusual high level of reassessments taking place for NDIS participants over the age of 65, and an equally high level of those reassessments saying you no longer meet eligibility for the NDIS and your needs are best supported by aged care. So there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that there is a very concerted focus on trimming the number of people within the NDIS, and they're starting to reveal what their focus areas are at this particular point in time. Joe, I'll check in. Any questions so far that we need to look at, or just keep going?
Nothing yet. Something just fresh in from Elaine. How will that fit in with the new change about the fact we're hearing that OT reports, etc., are not going to be used from next year? Yeah, right. So park that question for a little bit because we'll get to that needs assessment process. But you're right. The days of a participant having to sort of coordinate gathering all of that information, and usually that information we've been taught needs to present support recommendations, this ratio, this amount of support, etc., etc. That will all be replaced by the needs assessment process, and we'll talk about that in a second. Thanks for that question, Elaine. If anybody else has any more questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat or the Q&A section. Thank you very much. Yeah, awesome. All right, disability requirements. So again, these are for access to the scheme and nothing else. It's literally just your entry ticket. It doesn't now relate to funding plans, etc., etc. So obviously there's a diagnosis attributed to one or more impairments. It needs to be likely to be permanent or lifelong. It relates to a substantially reduced functional capacity. So a lot of these words have been tweaked in the last sort of 12 months to add things like substantially, those types of expressions. The permanent impairment affects employment, community and or social activities, and the person is likely to need that support for their lifetime. So again, this starts throwing question marks over
disabilities that may have periodic intensity periods, like psychosocial disability, for example, is very much in the spotlight as well in terms of eligibility. As I mentioned, once you meet access for one or more of the disability requirements, they are then mapped to impairment categories. There are 6 impairment categories, and they are intellectual, cognitive, neurological, sensory, physical, and psychosocial. So again, I'll use my lived experience example. So my son has cerebral palsy, he has epilepsy, and he has a substantial intellectual impairment. So he meets 3 impairment categories, which are intellectual, neurological, and physical. So despite the fact that cerebral palsy and epilepsy got him access to the scheme, his particular disabilities then get mapped to those impairment categories, and that is the last time his disability labels are needed in the NDIS process. Those impairment categories each unlock a needs assessment. So that's really important to understand. So again, in that example I gave a few moments ago, the NDIS did not have sufficient information on their system for him to meet the intellectual impairment category. So if he had gone forward based on the NDIS information without any challenging whatsoever, it would have ended up that his plan would have been built around physical and neurological support needs, completely ignoring the intellectual support needs. So as a result, there's no doubt in my mind his funding would have been substantially reduced, which would have been catastrophic for him and selfishly for me. So you definitely need to keep on top of all of this stuff that's taking place. Once those impairment categories are mapped, people will receive an impairment notice. So that's really important to review that impairment notice and make sure the correct impairment categories are there. The reason I keep stressing this is because unless you have that impairment category tick, you do not get a needs assessment associated with that impairment, and therefore you will not generate any support funding, etc. So we're yet to see impairment notices start rolling out at scale. I have seen a couple, and literally only a couple. We believe they're starting to roll out at scale early next year. We'll have to wait and see if that actually does occur. But again, we were told that this was going to start a year ago en masse, and it hasn't really happened, which is fairly consistent with a lot of things changing in the NDIS. The NDIS's actual own timescale for when this stuff would occur is substantially running behind schedule at this particular point in time. And it seems to be a little bit haphazard in terms of the order that they're doing things in. The needs assessment. So the needs assessment looks at those impairment categories. You have to have substantially reduced functional capacity. And if you're familiar with the NDIS construct, you'll know that the NDIS is built around functional domains. So self-management, self-care, mobility, learning, social interaction, communication. They will be all of the areas plus more that the needs assessment is testing. What sort of support is needed in this impairment category for self-management? Not all of them will come into play for every category. Obviously things, let's say, for example, physical, if you have a physical impairment category, self-management, self-care, mobility, etc. will certainly be the focus. If you've been following all of this stuff evolving, you'll know that the NDIS announced that they're going to base their needs assessment on the ICANN model. So ICANN was developed by the Melbourne School of Disability. The NDIS have said they're going to modify it. How they're going to modify it is anyone's guess at this particular point in time. I can assume they're going to modify it to fit the impairment categories a little bit more tightly. I can also assume, given if you've seen an ICANN assessment, it looks at a number of different categories. It has subcategories in each of those categories. So if you can imagine a big matrix, down one side of it are all the ICANN questions, and across the top are all the impairment categories. And I can imagine in each cell in that matrix, there's a funding amount. So if you meet this requirement in this particular question for this particular impairment, that's the amount of funding that you get. It might be a range, it might be a fixed number, who knows? But I can't see any other way that they're going to standardize the planning process the way that they want to without that sort of matrix approach, and potentially with a range, so that depending on where the person sits, you can have X to Y in terms of the funding in the plan translating to number of hours of support or type of equipment, whatever the case might be. So as we sit here currently, there are a test group of people with disability that are working with the NDIS and the Melbourne School of Disability to make those modifications to that process. I'm fortunate enough to know a person quite well that is on that panel or on that group of people and are receiving relatively frequent updates about how that process is going, etc. To their credit, the feedback I'm getting at this point in time is they're being incredibly collaborative about the process, how it's all going to fit together, etc. And I just hope that continues through to when the actual system starts rolling out. But initial signs are quite promising, the level of collaboration, etc., that is taking place. So I just want to touch on the functional domains, because this is where we see a lot of people currently coming unstuck when it comes to putting forward justification for NDIS funding. Sorry, Joe, did you want to jump in there? No, all good. So we've been through diagnosis, which is the disability requirements get you access to the scheme. You get assigned impairment categories mapped to those disability requirements. What is happening currently, and will continue to happen for a number of years until all of these new processes roll out, is that participants, their families, providers, etc., reach out, allied health specialists, etc., and say, we need a functional capacity assessment or a psychology report, whatever the case might be, to justify certain support needs for this individual. What I typically find is that a lot of those reports go from, this is the disability, this is how it kind of presents itself, and therefore these are the support needs. So it might be this person has relies on a wheelchair to get around, and they need some assistance for transferring personal care, whatever the case might be, and therefore they need 2-to-1 supports, 4 hours a day, etc., etc. They miss the functional impact step of really describing what does that impairment actually do, or how does that impact the person's daily life. So it doesn't describe that the person needs this sort of assistance for transfer, or their limitations of this, and they need this type of assistance, which translates to this number of hours. So if you are involved in that process until it does actually expire and it's fully replaced with the needs assessment process, keep that in mind. It's a 3-step process to go from the symptom, the impact, and then to the support needs. Really, really important, because the NDIS no doubt have really sophisticated systems that are doing a lot of pre-analysis of reports, and they're tuned to find points where the NDIS can say that's not reasonable and necessary, and then therefore not assign the appropriate funding. And again, I assume most people have been exposed to some form of that taking place, certainly in the last couple of years, and it seems to be amplified in the last 12 months. So if you are experiencing that, where what you believe is a fantastic report's gone forward, prosecuting all of these support needs, etc., and you get a response back from the NDIS and you're sitting there going, well, they just ignored everything that I said. Well, actually, they didn't ignore it. They actually were very clever about using the words, etc., to just determine what they are actually going to justify in terms of the support needs. All right, the other thing that we've seen in the last 12 months, the support lists. So what are NDIS supports, what are not NDIS supports, and over on the side, there's some replacement supports. Now, wouldn't get too excited about replacement supports at this particular point in time, because it's a very short list. They're mainly technology based, and from the NDIS owned data, we're seeing roughly 50% of replacement support requests actually being approved at this point in time, and not a big number. I think from memory, it was around 1,000 over the last 12 months, of which about roughly 500 were approved. So it's not big numbers. I do expect to see more things pop up on the replacement support list over time, but as yet we haven't seen a change from when it was originally announced. Now, why are these lists important? It's because the way the NDIS is now structuring their claiming, their compliance requirements for providers, to make sure that providers are not claiming for something that is not an NDIS support, and then dancing potentially along that line of fraud. When these were introduced, there was a 12-month grace period from October 24 to October 25. We're obviously in November. That grace period has now expired. So there is now no longer any excuse that you don't implicitly understand what's in and what's out. To further complicate things, we've seen a bunch of new operational guidelines released, especially over the last 6 months. As recently as in the last couple of weeks, we saw a new short-term respite, it's now called. It used to be short-term accommodation, now short-term respite. A new medium-term accommodation operational guideline, a whole bunch of others, therapeutic support operational guidelines, so on and so forth. They further refine what is appropriate, what's not appropriate when it comes to an NDIS support. So you kind of have to read these lists in conjunction with the operational guidelines that relate to the particular type of support or service that's being delivered and to be claimed for. So again, the complication or the depth of knowledge that providers need to have is just consistently increasing to understand what's possible, what's not possible. And the NDIS's sense of humor around sort of putting up with people erring from what is not is definitely waning. So we are seeing quite a lot of compliance action. And I believe even in the press today, there was further discussions around the Commission and the NDIS further ramping up compliance and audit processes to further make sure everyone's doing the right thing. Sorry, Joe, did you have a question or no? All good? Very good. Okay, what are the responsibilities with the support list from a participant's perspective? So as we had that 12 months grace, that has now lapsed in the last sort of 3 to 4 weeks. If a person purchases something that is on the out list, they may, that they being the NDIS, contact the person up to twice to explain why it is not an NDIS support and why that person is no longer able to claim that service, whatever the case might be. If they continue to ignore it, a debt can be raised. Now, there's not a huge amount of detail about how that debt process will work, but I'm assuming we're going to get a little bit more exposure to it given that grace period has recently lapsed. What is also likely to happen, and potentially more so than debt, or some debt recovery process, is the NDIA can move a person to be agency managed, whether that's their entire plan, parts of their plan, whatever the case might be. I would assume that would be the approach the agency would take for people that are caught with that sort of two-strike approach. That will be the initial step. Let's move part or all of their plan to agency managed, where we can keep a closer eye on it, rather than pursuing that person for debt. Because as we all know, the last time the federal government did some sort of wide-scale debt recovery process, it's still causing issues in the press. The two-strike approach doesn't apply to things like purchasing something just blatantly illegal or committing clear fraud. Obviously, that is direct approach rather than the two-strike, where it is just potentially an innocent mistake or a misunderstanding, because let's face it, there is so much information that people need to understand about what is right and what is not right. All right, stated supports. Now, this is interesting. I'm going to spend a bit of time on stated supports. I'm going to spend a bit of time on funding periods and funding amounts as well. So stated supports, And where you will typically see this coming up in people's plans will be in the capacity building area of their plan. And again, I'll use a real life example with my son. So when he went through that plan transition process into PACE, he had funding in capacity building for OT, speech, and physio. And the funding he received, if you look at an annual plan amount, was roughly what was requested and what is reasonable and necessary for him. So ticks, fantastic, he's got the funding. However, wrapped around that were each support was stated and there were quarterly funding periods. So what that means, and I'll use some really, really easy numbers to make it simple to follow. So let's say the total budget across all of those different capacity building supports was $12,000. Quarterly amounts, so each quarter he had $3,000 to spend. However, the $3,000 is then further sort of categorized into $1,000 for speech, $1,000 for OT, and $1,000 for physio. So in a particular period, if he needed, for example, a $3,000 OT report, because they were stated down to the individual allied health practitioner level, he would have to wait 3 periods to accumulate the $3,000 in his budget to be able to afford that report. And that was something that we hadn't fully sort of got our heads around until we saw it, and then we saw the practical mechanics behind it of claiming, etc., and then realized, oh, wait a minute, this is not good. It assumes that the capacity building supports are a consistent spend across the plan period. Now, in some cases, sure, that might be appropriate. If you're in the therapy allied health area, you'll know that the new operational guideline focuses very much around, are they capacity building or are they maintenance supports? Now, if they're a maintenance support, which is making sure the person's capacity doesn't decline, that standard approach over 12 months might be more than appropriate. If it is more of a capacity building support, let's say the person's had a catastrophic injury, undergone a step change, a step decline in capacity in a particular area, and they need some really focused support from a particular type of therapy, that may not be possible the way that the funding periods and stated supports are working. So that is something to be really, really mindful of, especially from a participant perspective, to understand how your funding may work. Equally from a provider perspective, because if you are working with people that have a lot of flexibility around their support funding, they spend, all of their budget in a 3-month period because that's what's right for them in terms of their condition and etc. That may no longer be possible depending on how their plan is structured. So stated supports, I would err against it. I would say just have your capacity building budget, don't have them stated down to the individual therapy level, and if possible, really advocate for as long as possible funding periods because you get more flexibility within that period. We've also seen some evidence that the funding period duration has some sort of direct correlation to people that have had issues with their plan management in the past. So people that may have been found that they weren't spending appropriately on the appropriate supports, etc. We have seen some people where their funding periods in the capacity building are monthly, which is really, really restrictive. And for me, it assumes everyone is in that maintenance spend. None of it is to do with actual capacity building. So really important to understand the nuances of the wording might sound fantastic, but how that then translates into operation it can be incredibly restrictive. Now, we also know in SIL and home and living, the funding periods are monthly. So if you're a SIL provider, you have monthly releases of funding. Again, let's use some really easy numbers. $240,000 for this person over 12 months for SIL funding, 20 grand a month. That means you can only claim up to $20,000 a month. If you, for whatever reason, spend $25,000 worth of supports because the person was sick or whatever the case might be, you cannot claim it. You can only claim up to the 20. Conversely, if you only spent 15 because the person was away for a week, whatever the case might be, the $5,000 underspend rolls forward into the next funding period. If it's not used then, it rolls forward to the end of the plan duration. So what that generally means for providers, especially in the SIL environment, where you cannot predict. I know everything's built around a typical week, but everyone's weeks are different. If you need to have that buffer to cover off when things don't happen the way that everyone planned, it is really important to keep an eye on those funding periods and potentially be underspending to move forward a bit of a buffer for when things don't go as planned and you need that extra funding for a particular period of time. We'll talk more about that in a second as well. So no more plan top-ups. I don't think there's many providers left that are working on the context that the NDIS made a mistake, and we'll just put in a review of circumstance. If you look at the NDIS data, there are tens of thousands of review of circumstances or change of circumstances outstanding at this point in time. The agency has no desire to work through them in a hurry, and the ones that are being worked through are generally getting a response saying there's no additional funding. It's not reasonable and necessary, etc. So if you are working with clients that have funding reductions, if you are a provider and you are looking at intake for a person and they don't have the appropriate funding or what you believe is appropriate at that point in time, really think long and hard about saying, that's okay, come on in. We'll just put in a change of circumstance. The NDIS will realise their mistake in the next couple of months and everyone will live happily ever after. It just does not work that way anymore for 99.99% of cases. The only way the NDIS and the changes to the Act, Section 45, actually states this, the only way that they'll actually look at it is the participant has experienced fraud or financial exploitation, whether it will prevent or lessen imminent threat to the participant's life, health, or safety. Now, this might be an urgent shift of a person living in SIL for a breakdown of relationships, etc., violence, whatever the case might be. We have seen some extreme circumstances where a plan will be put in place for 6 months to enable that person to move. Participants been unable to request a plan variation reassessment due to their impairments or lack of decision-making support, or the participant has requested a variation due to a crisis or emergency that result in significant change to their support needs. So really clear, concise reasons that a plan top-up may be considered. And the language is not, we will top up your plan if you fit these categories. It is, we'll at least consider it with a strong possibility of the response being no. So be really mindful of that. For providers that are working in that pretext of we'll put a change of circumstances and get more funding, I would really caution on that approach moving forward. I think it's fraught with danger.
Brent, thank you. That's a really, I think this is a really crucial part of this webinar. And we've had a great question here from Jodie Cox. Thanks for joining us today, Jodie. As a plan manager, we are seeking to receive clarity from the agency as to whether claims that exceed the FP can be subsidised in the next FP when funds are released. Mechanically, we can pay back into a previous FP funding period, but unable to confirm if we are allowed to. The NDIA at this stage are not confirming this, and various interpretations are in play across the sector.
Right. So just to make sure I've got the question right, I'm a very visual person, so I'm visualizing something in my head. So you got $4,000 each funding period. You've spent $4,000. Well, actually, you spent $6,000 in this period, and you want to I'm going to claim $4,000. And I'm going to wait a week until the new funding period kicks off. Then I'm going to claim $2,000, which is really from the previous funding period, which leaves me $2,000 for that funding period. I think that is, have I got that right, Joe? Do you think?
I believe so. Jodie, if you'd like to offer some clarification on that, but I believe that is correct. Just give it a thumbs up if Brent has. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So again, I can't show you this it's not that I won't. I can't show you this in writing from the NDIS because I don't have it. I only have it verbally from the NDIS, and the answer is no, you cannot do that because it negates the whole reason they put funding periods in place. Now, I've asked for that, and a lot of my colleagues have asked for that same thing in writing. Can we get some clarification so we can get that out to the sector? Because this question's coming up more and more. And we're exactly the same as you, Jody. We're sort of sitting there monitoring our inbox going, yep, no, nothing yet, nothing yet, nothing yet. They just, for some reason, don't want to put it in writing. I don't understand that. But we have certain verbally have been told by multiple different people that you cannot do that. I hope that helps. May or may not help.
Thanks, Jody. And we've got an opportunity at the end as well to expand on this if you would like in our Q&A session. Thanks very much, Brent.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so risks of all this stuff that's happening. We already spoke about the older cohort, and we're starting to see a relatively large number of people being ejected and shifted into aged care. Now, a couple of reasons why that's happening. One is that their impairments, the supporting evidence that's being used to potentially put in for a plan reassessment, and I have personally seen this scores of times. You open up a very impressive report, and in the summary, it talks about this person, support needs are changing because they're aging. And straight away, from the NDIS perspective, that is a free kick for the NDIS to aged care, because you've actually just said the reason their support needs is changing because of their age. It's got nothing to do with their disability. And that they're absolutely all over that at the moment. There's no doubt in my mind, obviously young people, that's very visual with young people with psychosocial autism, etc. Very public about what's happening in that space. The other end of the age spectrum with people aging is definitely a focus area at the moment. And it pains me to say it, but the other area that is certainly a focus is psychosocial across the entire age spectrum of the NDIS at this point in time. So I liken the reassessment process to sort of an onion. And what the NDIS are going to do, they're going to start peeling off the layers. They're going to start peeling off the ones that are the most speculative in their mind in terms of people that should be on the scheme, should not be on the scheme. They'll keep peeling those layers off until they get towards the core. And then there'll be people like people with cerebral palsy, people with spinal injuries, brain injuries, etc. Stuff that you just absolutely, poster situation for the NDIS. It's permanent, it's catastrophic, significant support needs, lifelong, all of those sorts of things. So you could expect that cohort of people to almost be the last to be reassessed, because that is literally almost a tick and flick process, and put them through the new funding algorithm to see what spits out at the other end. So it's the ones that are sort of in that psychosocial space, the ones that, potentially met access because they had some really, really good people behind them prosecuting the reason why they should be on the scheme. They're the ones in my mind that are at the biggest risk at this particular point in time until we work through all those different layers. So as I said, be careful to describe support needs or increases in support needs resulting from aging. In terms of their disability, don't mention aging if you're working with that particular cohort of people. Take that three-step process, the symptom, the functional impact, the support need. Don't miss the functional impact component, because that's the one that will really link it all together. Okay, so obviously there's confusion, there's delays, there's panic, there's anxiety. I completely get that. If you're a parent, if you're a participant sitting here looking at this, I can feel your anxiety because I feel it myself. If you're a provider, you're probably feeling similar levels of anxiety, albeit from probably slightly different perspectives. No one likes change, and this is, I have no doubt, this is the biggest change in the NDIS from inception, from 12 years ago. This is quite a substantial change to how everything fits together. Next one, if you're a support coordinator or a participant, this one's going to be a little bit more controversial. Sharing of plans is now necessary as wording is very specific. Now, is necessary, very, very emotive words, etc. I'm not cutting across anyone's choice and control. Everyone has the choice to not share their plan. All I'm asking people to consider, and people, when I say people, participants, families, support coordinators, etc., is everything that we've just spoken about with funding periods, funding components, stated supports, downward pressure on budgets, etc. All I ask you respectfully to do is put yourself in the provider's shoes, and see how they can try to figure out how to give you or your loved one, your client, the best possible support when they're flying blind. They don't know all of these mechanics about how the plan fits together. In the past, where a plan was just a bunch of money, spend it over 12 months, self-managed, plan managed, relatively flexible, etc. Happy days. Yeah, maybe it was a lot easier in those times. You could have a look at how service bookings were traveling, etc., etc. Now with PACE and the relative invisibility from a provider perspective, providers' level of trust in the funding components, all of that information is really high. And I'm seeing providers every day getting in financial trouble because what they were told is not actually correct and they're getting claims rejected, etc. Now, a lot of that's happening innocently because this stuff's complicated. And quite often people will read their plan and not really understand what it all means from a provider perspective. So I would just encourage people if you are in that school of saying, no way, I'm not sharing my plan, I respect that and I'll continue to respect that forever. All I respectfully ask is just try to take a step back and understand it from the other perspective. And over time, if you build trust in a relationship with a provider, think about actually sharing some of that information, etc. From a provider, a really regimented intake process and learn when to say no is really important. Saying no in our sector is really uncomfortable, but it's better than going broke as a provider.
That's very true, Brent. We've just had another input here from Elaine Evans. As a support coordinator, I find the breakdown of the funds that can be sent from the local area coordinator or NDIA is very important, also as the plan doesn't always have all the details.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other complicating factor to that is providers are almost blind. When they go into the portal, if a participant's in PACE, the information they can see is next to nothing. So yeah, it is really important that information is shared. And I really do say, if you want to get the best from your provider and the best possible support, sharing that information is going to help. Now, obviously, there are a very small percentage of unscrupulous providers out there for sure. Don't tar everyone with that brush. Give them the benefit of the doubt. The funding periods, all of that stuff gives you protection. It stops a provider from just going in and fleecing your plan now. So you're protected as well. So I'd really, really encourage that.
It's a great point that there is that extra level of protection with those funding periods.
Yeah, it works in both ways.
Thanks, Brent.
PACE, I'm not going to touch on much longer. I'm mindful of the time, etc. Just know that there are some changes. So there are now 4 support types. There are no changes to the support items, but there are some additional support categories in PACE for this particular cohort, and we'll get to a list very shortly. Home and living as its own category is one of the key changes. I've also been through this, but I'll just highlight it again around the funding amounts and components. Just keep in mind, if as a provider in particular, you're planning for a crisis, you're planning for day programs not operating for 6 weeks over Christmas, you're planning for the participant's family going away and they can't go home every weekend for a month, etc. Now gets really complicated and complex because you have to figure out when's that happening in their plan cycle, how much funding are they going to need, and how do I work that back across the funding periods leading up to that point to make sure I've pushed a bow wave of funds forward to that funding period when I need it, when I know that person's going to need some additional support, etc. So the complexities from a provider to do that cash flow, and it is just become a little bit harder. And unfortunately, from what we're seeing from a lot of the software vendor platforms that a lot of providers rely on, they kind of haven't got their heads around how to do this just yet. So a little bit more manual intervention. And of course, you can only do that if people have shared all that information with you. So I won't harp on about that anymore. There are the different categories. in terms of PROTA versus PACE. I won't go through these. I'm just mindful of the time as well. And I want to get to some questioning, the big one being home and living being its own category, monthly funding periods and components in home and living funding, SDA, SIL, etc., all monthly. All right, 10 minutes. That were pretty much on time, Joe.
Fantastic time management there, Brent. Thank you very much. We greatly appreciate it. Yeah, some really crucial information there for everybody, and some key things to take away. We're now going to open the floor up to everybody. If you do have any questions, the questions may not even relate to what we've discussed in this webinar. This is your opportunity to speak to an industry expert about any grievances or about any queries you may have. So if you do have any questions, please shoot them into the chat or the Q&A section. Now we'll leave this open for a couple of moments. In the meantime, as mentioned at the start, we have recorded this session. And we will send a copy of the slide deck to all registered attendees, and the recording will be available on our YouTube page, which is KinKera Community, for free viewing. You will also be able to find our earlier webinar, A Strategic Guide to SDA Applications with Greg Barry, there as part of this ongoing series. So feel free to share these links with colleagues, families, or anyone else you think will benefit. And if you found today useful, we would really appreciate it if you keep an eye out for future sessions in this series and share them through your own networks. The more informed people are, the better the outcomes we are going to see for participants and families. We've got a question here, Brent, from Julie. Release of funding periods due to crisis. What is the processing timeframes?
Infinite at this particular point in time. We're not seeing a very timely response at all, especially to a crisis. I've seen a couple, and now these have both been in SDA and SIL environments where there has been a dramatic shift in capacity for individuals, and they would be, where are we now? 3 months ago, and no word back from the NDIS about bringing funding forward, or even, in fact, on-the-fly reassessment, etc., due to circumstances beyond anyone's control. So I wouldn't be relying on it, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Brent. I have one myself. You mentioned earlier, you alluded to the timeframes of change of circumstances, many thousands outstanding. What sort of timeframe are we looking at here from those submissions of change of circumstance through to getting an answer?
Plus 12 months at the moment.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
We have a couple more questions here as well from Carol. What advice for people needing a plan review for more funding because the initial plan totally inadequate for spinal cord injury participants?
Okay. There's a couple of things here. Now, I don't know where you're coming from in terms of, participant, family, therapist, support coordinator, provider, whatever the case might be. If I had to, in absence of sort of detailed information around it, where I typically see a situation where a person with quite significant support needs getting really small plan outcomes is generally based on the quality of the supporting information that's gone forward. And it's usually missing out the functional impact step. And it might be, I saw one just recently where it wasn't a spinal injury. I'm just trying to remember the circumstances in this one, but it basically said in black and white that due to this person's, what was it? Oh, it will come back to me, but it was nothing related to disability. It was a health related issue. Due to this person's XYZ, they need all this support. Or the computer at the NDIS would have just gone, health. Health can fund all of that stuff because you've just told me it's a health-related issue. It's got nothing to do with disability, and you haven't told me what the functional impact is. So that could be a possibility. Now, certainly, going through those reports, getting the supporting evidence, and continually asking yourself those 3 steps: disability, functional impact, support needs, and making sure that argument's prosecuted. Health, aging, all of those other trigger words just don't appear whatsoever in the report to make sure that you're not inadvertently flipping it off to another system.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to, we do have a few more questions. Carol has put another one in just quickly, just on top of that. How exactly can you see what their impairment list is?
So you can assist a participant to reach out to the NDIS to ask what information they have around what Met access. Now, most people at the moment who have access, they'll be able to answer that question in terms of what diagnosis information Met access to the scheme. Most people will not have that mapped to impairments just yet. So you could, if you reached out today for a particular person, get the response saying we haven't mapped that yet, but there are some documents available. If you can reach out to myself and Joe at those email addresses, I can definitely send you the document that's done all of that mapping. This is the disability diagnosis. This is the impairment category, so that you can at least see, based on that person's access disabilities, what impairment notices or what impairment categories they will meet. So all that work's already been done.
Thanks, Brent. And Carol, you will receive an EDM after this with both mine and Brent's contact details so that you can reach out to him. Good friend Jonas, so if I run out in a funding period for assistance in daily life just by a small amount, can I use funding from my new funding period to pay for unpaid support from the previous funding period?
No, strictly speaking. Does that happen? I dare say it does. But strictly speaking, it kind of circles back to that question that we had earlier. The NDIS's stance on that, not in writing, mind you, at this point in time, is no. Funding period relates to supports actually purchased in that period, and that can only be funded in that period. So that is the response. And I kind of get part of that explanation around that's the whole reason we've got them there, to limit the spending in these sort of blocks. But the downside of that is it does not in any way reflect what a typical person with disability support needs. They fluctuate, right? They're never the same.
Okay, thanks, Brent. Elaine has asked, can Brent explain a little about the changes to respite funding and options? If you could summarise this quite quickly for us, Brent.
Yeah, sure. How long do I have? First of all, the change from short-term accommodation to respites annoyed a lot of people because we were kind of happy that respite had disappeared, but that's by the side. That's not answering the question. I'm just buying myself some time as the brain's working. A lot more restrictive. I think the new operational guideline mentions about 50 times that it can't be holiday, you can't have any fun. It's got to be sort of base level accommodation. You can't have food. It's
can't go interstate, things like this.
Not go interstate, not use an aeroplane. Really, really restrictive down to reading between the lines. A group activity of people with disability being supported on a ratio basis to do exactly what they do at home, but just do it in a different setting. Making sure that they don't have fun.
Thank you for that.
A little bit facetious, but I personally think short-term accommodation was a fantastic thing for people with disability to be able to access other things, other options, test different living options, test different environments, etc. And I think, like all good things, a very small minority of people have ruined it for the majority.
Thanks, Brent. Velvet, I can appreciate your frustration here in regards to the invitation at 2 p.m. That was stated for Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. So we did start at 1 p.m, I'm afraid, but you are able to catch back this webinar on our YouTube page. We will share that link with you, and that will be available in the coming days. I am sorry about that, Velvet. Moving on, Jodie Cox from Future Plan Management, related to Julie's question, which was regarding periods.
I just read that.
Okay, so interestingly, an LAC told a participant recently just to hold over the invoice until the next funding period. Utter confusion over whether this is allowed until the NDIA categorically confirms this to all plan managers. We have no choice but to keep paying backwards into previous periods as the messaging is so inconsistent. Would be very key to find out exactly what the role was of the NDIA telling you it is 100% not permitted, Brent. This is the single biggest question on a plan manager's plate at present.
Yeah, all I can say is the person has director in their title, which, you know, that's not a big thing. I think out of the 20,000 employees, 19,000 have director of something in their title. So I'm not quite sure how senior that particular person was. But look, I know of hundreds of people that are doing exactly that, but it is just pushing the problem forward. That's the risk. Now, obviously, if it pushes it into a period in the future in the plan window where spend is not as big and you recoup that sort of shortfall, fantastic, happy days, and everything continues going on. But if it's going to be a recurring problem, it's not going to push too far into the future until the problem has to be addressed. So I can kind of see both sides of where we're currently sitting, but completely agree. Like all good things, NDIS, wouldn't it be nice if they just came out and told us what we're supposed to be doing? That would make life so much easier.
Thanks for that one, Jody. And final question, I believe, from Angela. In the assistance with daily life funding section of the new plans, it is tending to advise a set amount of funding for MTA for 13 weeks and then SIL funding for the rest of the plan. Can a SIL provider use the MTA funding as transitional funding in the SIL home, or is this considered stated for MTA only?
I would have to see the actual wording because there are a couple of different versions of that at the moment. Now, MTA funding strictly, if it's in the plan correctly, will be for accommodation only. So it's the daily amount, $150, whatever it is currently.
153.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks, Joe. If that's in there, then can a SIL provider access that to pay for rent? Is effectively what you're saying for a vacancy in a home? Potentially, yes, but I'd have to see how the actual plan is structured to fully answer that question. And again, quite sincerely, I'm happy, reach out to myself, Joe, after this webinar with any questions, further clarifications, etc. It may take me a few days, but I will definitely get back to you.
Thank you, Brent. And what I'll do, Angela, is I'll forward that example to Brent for him to get back to you on. I think there was a few residual people joining there quite late. I would imagine that could be down to the settings on your Outlook being for a different time frame. I'm really sorry, it did start at 2 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time, 1 p.m. Queensland time. If you have missed this webinar, you are welcome to view it again on our YouTube page, KinKera Community. It will be uploaded at the start of next week. We will also be sending an email to all of you with a slide deck of this presentation. And like I said, you can watch this recording back. There are contact details for both myself and Brent in that email that you should receive very shortly. Brent, I just wanted to wrap things up by thanking you for your time today. It was really insightful from an industry expert, and it's really great to see that everybody, all the attendees are progressively keeping up to date with the NDIS and the changes. There's a message there from our techie. Don't worry, the webinar is recorded and will be posted online. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and keep an eye on your inbox for an email out to all of you. Thank you, everybody who asked a question, and I look forward to seeing you in the next webinar, which will be the start of 2026.
And thanks, Joe. Thanks for Joe, KinKera. Keep up the good work.
No, thank you, Brent. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a great afternoon.